All right, good morning. Been looking forward to this conference, and my first subject for this morning, and my only real concern is fitting everything within the time, so I'm just going to jump right in. First subject for this morning is what I kind of realized when I was invited to speak on the 6th chapter of our confession would kind of have to be the first subject that we discuss, and that is the doctrine of the covenant of works, or the presence or absence of the covenant of works within the Second London Confession of Faith. And it's certainly not at all intimidating to lecture on the confessional particular Baptist doctrine of the covenant of works in front of Dr. James Renahan, Dr. Sam Renahan, Dr. What's his name? Rich Barcelos back there. So I can be thankful for a couple of things. I can be thankful that I can rely upon my own vastly superior knowledge on this issue. And then I can be thankful also that I can rely upon the definitive commentary on our confession of faith that thankfully Dr. Renahan has finally gotten published. That we've all been waiting for with bated breath, and it's finally arrived. Because one of the footnotes, as I was discussing this matter, one of the footnotes in an article by Dr. Renahan said, "I'll be discussing this matter of why the covenant of works terminology was taken out of the Second London Confession of Faith in various places in my forthcoming book." And we're still waiting on that, but we'll pray. I am, though, certainly deeply indebted to these men for much of the content of this lecture. And so while I have sought to do my own study, my own work on the primary source material and in certain formulations of these arguments, I do have to admit at the end of the day I have very little of completely original content to offer you. And so I hope that the benefit of this lecture for some of us is that just in matter of synthesis, originality is overrated anyway, and when it comes to theology is normally kind of dangerous. So I like to stay in the familiar paths. But hopefully just as a benefit as synthesis, kind of bringing together of some of the arguments that these men have made in various places and written on in various times. So the subject is appropriate for a conference on chapter 6 of our Confession of Faith. Although this debate over the presence or absence or meaning of the covenant of works in the Second London Confession of Faith normally takes its starting point in chapter 7. But it is appropriate now because chapter 6 certainly does contain all of the essential elements of the covenant of works without using the explicit term. And also, significantly, this is the first place in which the Second London actually does remove the term covenant of works from one of its parent documents. If you look at chapter 6, paragraph 1, the Second London does differ quite radically both from the Westminster and the Savoy. The Westminster is definitely the briefest. It simply begins, "Our first parents being seduced by the subtlety and temptation of Satan, sinned in eating the forbidden fruit." The Savoy expands on this and introduces the category of the covenant of works. In fact, right up front in chapter 6, the Savoy goes after the covenant of works. "God, having made a covenant of works and life, thereupon with our first parents and all their posterity in them, they being seduced by the subtlety and temptation of Satan did willfully transgress the law of their creation and break the covenant," so mentioning covenant twice there, "in eating the forbidden fruit." Now our confession is by far the lengthiest because it retains some of the additions of the Savoy, it restores some of the language of the Westminster, and then it actually incorporates material from the First London Confession of Faith. And this, of course, is what our confession says. "Although God created man upright and perfect and gave him a righteous law which had been unto life had he kept it, and threatened death upon the breach thereof, yet he did not long abide in this honor, Satan using the subtlety of the serpent to seduce Eve, then by her seducing Adam, who without any compulsion did willfully transgress the law of their creation, and the command given unto them in eating the forbidden fruit, which God was pleased, according to his wise and holy counsel, to permit, having purpose to order it to his own glory. Notably, the Second London does not follow the example of the Savoy here in appealing to the category, at least not directly, the category of the covenant of works. Instead, using the language of a righteous law and of command. So this is the first place in which the question of the place of the covenant of works arises in our confession, but it certainly is not the last. Most famously, the Second London completely deletes the second paragraph of chapter 7 as found in both the Westminster and the Savoy, and that paragraph reads, the first covenant made with man was a covenant of works, wherein life was promised to Adam and in him to his posterity, upon condition of perfect and personal obedience. So explicit statement and explicit definition of the covenant of works there in chapter 7 and paragraph 2 that has been removed from our confession. That reference then even to that covenant in the next paragraph, which is paragraph 2 of ours, paragraph 3 in the Westminster and the Savoy, is changed in our confession again. That covenant, they removed the word covenant and changed it to a reference to the law. And then finally, in chapter 19 and paragraph 1, chapter 19 and paragraph 1 is the final place in which the phrase covenant of works was removed, was omitted by our confession. The Second London retains some of the additional clauses from the Savoy that they had added to the Westminster, but our confession omits from both the Westminster and the Savoy another explicit reference to the covenant of works. They both confess that God gave to Adam a law as a covenant of works. And so this certainly does raise an important question. Why did the editors of our confession delete these explicit references to the covenant of works? Any careful study of our confession and comparison with the Westminster and the Savoy will reveal very clearly and quickly that any changes that our confession made, those were made intentionally and purposefully, carefully. So what are we to make of its apparent reticence to confess the covenant of works in explicit terms? Did our particular Baptist forefathers simply reject the Reformed and Puritan consensus on the doctrine of the covenant of works, as some proponents of New Covenant theology have argued? As we'll see, that would be an extremely difficult case to make, extremely difficult, even from our confession itself. But others have argued that these deletions are indicative of a particular Baptist redefinition of this doctrine. So not a wholesale rejection, but some sort of subtle redefinition. They sort of believed in the covenant of works, some sort of covenantal arrangement with Adam in the garden, but they didn't really hold to it in the exact way, in the exact terms that the Westminster and the Savoy and other Puritans of the day did. Among those making the argument for a kind of redefinition is Dr. Greg Nichols in his influential book, Covenant Theology, a Reformed and Baptistic Perspective on God's Covenants. In that work, Dr. Nichols actually spends very little time in the body of the book dealing with the covenant of works or with any idea of a pre-fall covenant. Begins his discussion in the body of the book, his discussion of the biblical covenants, he begins it with the covenant of grace. He begins it with the Proto-Evangelium. And he reserves any lengthy discussion of the covenant of works for an appendix at the end of the book. But after reviewing the deletions of the term covenant of works in the Second London and acknowledging that, quote, it does not remove every vestige of this doctrine, Dr. Nichols nevertheless ultimately concludes, these deletions are significant and strategic. They express difference. The Baptist fathers do not deny a pre-fall covenant with Adam, yet at the very least, they decline to confess a covenant of works as defined in Westminster Confession of Faith 7.2, 19.1, and in Savoy Declaration 6.1. Thus, the covenant of works doctrine does not have the same prominence in London Confession of Faith that it has in the Westminster Standards and Savoy Declaration, unquote. This observation on his part, that this does express difference, that there was, it didn't give as much of a preeminent place to the doctrine of the covenant of works in the Second London. This observation, or this contention, is made in support of Dr. Nichols' own redefinition of the traditional doctrine of the covenant of works, which on his part consists of primarily in his objection not to the idea of a covenant before the fall, but rather his rejection of the idea of a covenant of works before the fall. And so he prefers to use the term the covenant with Adam, or the Adamic covenant. He still will call it a covenant, but it's not a covenant, as he says, of works. Following such redefinitions as those of John Murray, Dr. Nichols rejects the idea of any possibility of merit in man's relationship with God, of a work-reward system, and so objects to the idea of a covenant of works specifically. He also objects to the assertion of the promise of a reward of further heightened eschatological life that was held out to Adam upon fulfillment of the terms of the covenant during a probation period. Again, such as adherence to the traditional understanding of the covenant of works have maintained. So that's our question. That's our question. Why did the editors of our confession omit the explicit language of the covenant of works in multiple places? Not just one, not just two, really in at least 3 places. Was their decision to omit that language indicative of their rejection or redefinition of the doctrine? Or are there other possible explanations? And so we'll consider this question by considering 3 categories of relevant information. And I didn't even intend to really try to do this, but they are alliterated. Those of you who've listened to me preach before, I tend for that. I don't try to force it, but if it's just low hanging right there, I just grab it. So that's what I've done. So we're going to look at 3 categories of relevant information. First, we'll consider evidence from several signatories of our confession. Then we'll consider the relevant statements of our confession itself. And then finally, we'll consider the overall structure and, if I can use this term, style of our confession. And I'll suggest some positive, not just negative, reasons as to why such omissions perhaps were made. All right, so let's begin. First, the signatories to the confession. Now, I do want to be relatively brief here because Sam Renahan in his doctoral thesis has really already collated this evidence, as far as I can tell, pretty exhaustively. And he puts most of this in a nearly 2-page long footnote in the last chapter of his dissertation. So there's about this much text at the beginning, and then the rest of 2 pages is just footnotes. But again, quite exhaustive and quite helpful. And in that footnote, in addition to the particular Baptist whom he's already discussed in the main text, Sam cites some 17 others who explicitly acknowledge the covenant of works in their published works. So these are particular Baptists of that day who explicitly acknowledge the covenant of works. Now, I'm going to limit my sort of running through these simply to a few of those particular Baptist authors who were also original signatories to the Second London Confession of Faith. All right, because obviously they wholeheartedly subscribed this document, and it was a reflection of what they believed. So we can see from their writings on the covenant of works, or even just their passing references to the covenant of works, how they understood it. You know, did they disagree with it? Did they reject it? Did they redefine it in any way? So I'm going to talk about some original signatories, but then we have to talk, of course, about one man who certainly would have been a signatory originally to the Confession of Faith, had not God in his providence called him home shortly before he had the opportunity to do so. Again, the relevance of this discussion should be obvious. So of the original signatories to the confession, of the Second London Confession, at least 5 left behind in their writings some direct references to the covenant of works. William Kiffin, William Collins, Hercules Collins, Benjamin Keach, and Thomas Winnell. Some of these references, again, are very brief, such as those of Hercules Collins, and I won't even read them through. They're just sort of mentioned in passing. And as Sam, as Pascal Deneau and others have recognized, and Sam writes, the covenant of works and the covenant of redemption as well receive passing and sparse mention from Collins, yet without the slightest hint of reservation. Right? So they can just mention them, but it's just assumed. The doctrine, the understanding of what it means and its place and its validity is simply assumed in their works. And so with someone like William Kiffin, Kiffin writes in one place, knowledge of the truth and obedience to it in outward performances will as little save man's soul as the covenant of works. Right? So he's just making a point about the ineffectiveness of these things to save, just as now we cannot be saved through the covenant of works. Kiffin, as with other particular Baptists, again, as he just mentions it there, he didn't seem to feel the need to define or to defend the concept of the covenant of works. Rather, it is just assumed. William Collins, in a catechism that he edited at the request of the 1693 General Assembly, a catechism that we now know as the Baptist Catechism, again, most likely worked on by William Collins, he followed word for word the answers that were given to questions 15 and 19 of the Westminster Shorter Catechism, which clearly confesses that God entered into a covenant of life with man upon condition of perfect obedience, and that this covenant was made with Adam not only for himself, but also for his posterity. It's just the classic doctrine of the covenant of works, even in the Baptist Confession itself, and one of the signatories who worked on that. A bit more fleshed out is a comment by Thomas Winnell. Adam stood not as a private, but as a public person. All were to stand and fall in him, he being the root and representative of mankind. Adam, therefore, being made our head in that first covenant by divine ordination, therefore his transgression is accounted ours. We see explicit reference to this first covenant, by which clearly he means a covenant of works. Of these original signatories, Benjamin Keach offers by far the most extensive discussion of the covenant of works, which he frequently mentions directly in contrast to the covenant of grace. Just for a couple quick examples, he writes, the first covenant was made with the first Adam for himself and his posterity as the common head of all mankind. Now, he writes later, as Adam, being a common person or head of all his seed, and we in him fell under sin, death, and condemnation by virtue of the covenant of works made with him. Again, brief though some of these statements are, they should be sufficient to show that of every original signatory to our confession who dealt with the covenant of works in their extant writings, none of them shy away from either the language or the basic Westminster Savoy understanding of this doctrine. Rather, they seem to feel free simply to assume the doctrine in their further argumentations. But of course, the most significant to this question are the writings of the man who was almost certainly the primary editor of our confession, though he was prevented by death from subscribing it at the General Assembly of 1689. And of course, that is Nehemiah Cox. In several of his books, but most particularly in his famous Discourse of the Covenants that God made with men before the law, Cox articulates a doctrine of the covenant of works that is perfectly consistent with, in fact, that is virtually identical to the Westminster and the Savoy doctrine and the consensus federalism of the day. He argues comprehensively for every element of the covenant of works, the federal headship of Adam, the requirement of both the moral law and the positive prohibition of eating from the tree, the threat of physical and eternal death, the corresponding promise of reward of eternal and heightened life and blessedness upon fulfillment of the law during a probation period. And, most significantly, he argues for the explicit and extensive, he gives the explicit and extensive defense of the nature of God's transaction with Adam as a covenant. As a covenant. He's got a whole section that just God's transaction with Adam, a covenant. Writes Cox, From these things, it is evident that God dealt with Adam not only on terms of a law, but by way of a covenant, or by way of covenant. This transaction with him was of a federal nature, although it is not in Scripture explicitly called a covenant. Yet it has the explicit nature of a covenant, and there is no reason for niceties about terms where the thing itself is sufficiently revealed to us. That's such an important concept that gets violated so often, because the same can be said not only of Genesis 1 through 3, the word covenant isn't there, well, all the elements of covenant are there, but you could say the same about many places in our confession, all right? The language of the covenant of works isn't there, but all of the elements are there, as we'll see. But God's arrangement with Adam before the fall for Cox was not just a covenant, but it was explicitly and clearly a covenant of works. It was a covenant of works. Cox is open to other names for this covenant, depending on from what perspective it's viewed. But, he writes, as to the terms and conditions of this covenant that God made with Adam and all mankind in him, so as to the terms and conditions, it was a covenant of works. And so set up that pattern of a work-reward system with that idea of meriting that is inherent in the language of reward. And so that's the term, covenant of works, that Cox clearly prefers, that he uses most regularly, because it is precisely with respect to the terms and conditions that the covenant of works contrasts with and helps us to appreciate the covenant of grace. And so that's the clearest and best name for it. It's precisely in terms of with respect to the terms and conditions that it contrasts with the new covenant. We need to move on. I just wanted to run through that really quickly so that it can be put to rest in all of our minds. None of the extant writings of any of the signatories or the editors of our confession give any indication of a hesitancy to confess explicitly the doctrine of the covenant of works and to use it in precisely the same way in which it's used in the Westminster and the Savoy. They had no desire to reject or to redefine that doctrine. Everywhere they do discuss it, it is identical with the doctrine of their Paedo-Baptist peers. And they didn't even have to discuss it that much because there was no disagreement over it. And no one was criticizing them as being unorthodox in their view of the covenant of works. Yes, there was divergence with the Paedo-Baptists in places over how the original covenant of works related to later covenants, the Mosaic covenant especially, the Old Covenant in general. But as to the covenant of works proper, there's not a hint of divergence from what is confessed in the Westminster and in the Savoy. So that's the signatories of the confession. So let's turn now, though, to consider the actual statements of our confession itself that relate to this. So the statements of the confession. Often forgotten when there's discussion over the proper interpretation of our confession is the original preface, the letter to the judicious and impartial reader that was published originally with our confession that lays out the overall purpose and philosophy behind the publication of the confession in the first place. First and foremost, it's very clear from this letter to the reader, the purpose of the publication of the confession was to clarify the particular Baptist general agreement with, rather than their disagreement with, their Paedo-Baptist peers, the other Puritans of the day, other Orthodox Puritan brethren. They wanted to, as they write, give testimony to the world of our firm adhering to those wholesome principles. They made use of the very same words as the Westminster and the Savoy, and they write, hereby declaring before God, angels, and men. That's strong language. I mean, this is the language of a vow. This is language of a religious oath. They're saying we are testifying in the presence of God, angels, and men. Sorry, I lost my place. Before God, angels, and men, our hearty agreement with them. And then the next assertion, I think, is especially significant for our purposes. Listen to this. It says, some things indeed are in some places added, some terms omitted, and some few changed. But these alterations are of that nature as that we need not doubt any charge or suspicion of unsoundness in the faith from any of our brethren upon account of them. And we need to take that seriously. Are we going to take them at their word or not? And they say, some places there's additions, there's omissions. Some terms have been omitted, but that's not proof that we're trying to disagree with you over this doctrine. We're not trying to change it. The assumption, what that really means is that even where there are comparatively minor additions, omissions, or changes to the Westminster and or the Savoy, the assumption without other proof should not be what it normally is, that they are trying to express a disagreement with the Westminster and the Savoy. Rather, the assumption on our part should be that those changes are relatively inconsequential, not a wholesale rejection or redefinition of doctrine, unless there is some clear and concrete evidence to the contrary. It means that the burden of proof is really on those who are trying to argue that there's a fundamental disagreement here or a fundamental redefinition. The burden of proof is on them. Is there any indication we have from any of their writings, which we just saw, that they really were trying to fundamentally disagree with the Westminster or the Savoy, even in their deletion of their omission of the term covenant of works? And again, the burden of proof, that should be our assumption that it's not unless we see otherwise. Because they go on to state that where there is intentional, substantial disagreement with those documents, they have gone out of their way to make that as clear as possible. So that, they conclude, that none might entertain jealousy of aught secretly lodged in our breasts that we would not the world should be acquainted with. And again, they're not just asserting this, but in solemn religious language, they're saying before God, angels, and men, we are affirming that where we really truly disagree, we have made that as clear as possible. But some of these relatively minor additions, omissions, changes, don't take that to mean anything other than, don't take it to mean anything. We agree fundamentally. So with the matter at hand, these omissions of the term covenant of works are relatively minor. And therefore, if we believe the signatories of the confession, and if we're going to take them at their word, they weren't attempting to hide or sneak in a fundamental... I was reading one article recently where he used that exact language. They're being sneaky. They're being tricky. And they're not trying to sneak in a fundamental rejection or redefinition of the major doctrine of the covenant of works without any further indication that they were doing so. And we don't have that. We do not have that. We should always assume fundamental agreement unless we have clear evidence to the contrary. But even just from the initial statements, we can get an idea. They're not trying to show some strong disagreement. But even within the body of the confession itself, too, we see positive affirmations of the doctrine of the covenant of works. If our particular Baptist forefathers were trying to ignore or change the covenant of works, they did a really bad job of it. They did a really poor job of it. Because even in those contexts where they omit the term, they not only retain every single traditional element of that doctrine, but sometimes they give a much fuller description of the doctrine of the covenant of works, even though the term itself isn't there. And they missed a couple. They missed a couple references to the covenant of works, explicit ones. I guess the find and change or find and delete function on Cox's word processor was glitchy that day. Because they had those back then, right? They forgot to erase a couple explicit references to the covenant of works, or didn't forget. They were intentional. They were careful in this. We have every indication. So where do we see the fundamental elements of the covenant of works, even where the term does not appear? Well, let's look and try to look relatively quickly. First is in chapter 4, and Dr. Renahan pointed this out to us, read this yesterday. But in chapter 4, paragraph 3, besides the law written in their hearts, they received a command not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which while they kept, they were happy in their communion with God and had dominion over the creatures. I mean, here we already see the moral law, the positive prohibition as conditions. We see an implicit threatened punishment, an implicit promised reward, which while they kept, they were happy in their communion with God. Far clearer is the first place in which our confession deletes or omits the term covenant of works in chapter 6, paragraph 1. Remember, the Savoy started this chapter out with that God made a covenant of works with our first parents. But in chapter 6, paragraph 1, listen, and again, just listen for the elements of the covenant of works, especially those elements as outlined by Nehemiah Cox and really every Reformed Federalist in the day. Although God created man upright and perfect and gave him a righteous law, which had been unto life had he kept it, and threatened death upon the breach thereof, yet he did not long abide in this honor. Now again, this is some language that's imported here, that expands upon what the Westminster First gives, and it's the normal nomenclature of the covenant of works. We see a condition, we see a promised reward, and that phrase there, unto life, that's how that's to be taken. It's unto. There's this goal. There's this something to be attained. It's unto. There's this movement, this progress toward it. It was unto. It was an aspiration. It was something higher that was a promised reward. And we see, of course, the threatened judgment. And then paragraphs 2 and 3 go on to express the covenantal idea of federal headship, especially paragraph 3. They being the root, and again, added in by the Savoy and retained by our confession, and by God's appointment standing in the room and stead of all mankind, the guilt of the sin was imputed and corrupted nature conveyed to all their posterity descending from them by ordinary generation. Then in chapter 7, paragraph 1 and paragraph 2. Now here, again, while omitting the term covenant of works, yet we see the language here of the reward of life that's retained from the Savoy. Life here explicitly called a reward, and hence bringing with it that idea of work and of merit, albeit, of course, and that's the whole point of paragraph 1 of chapter 7, not sort of a natural or absolute kind of merit whereby God was placed in man's debt because, as one writer put it, creatures are always indebted to their creator. The creator can never become indebted to his creatures. The creator-creature distinction. It's impossible, but it's a divinely instituted system of merit and reward by God's free and sovereign and voluntary condescension. It's like when I tell my daughter that if she cleans her room, I'll take her out for frozen yogurt. She owes me obedience as her father without any idea of reward. But I, in my free and generous condescension to her, choose to append the promise of a reward to that obedience that she already owes me as my daughter, although normally it's just an excuse for me to go get froyo. But this is the introduction here in chapter 7 in our confession to the broad concept of covenant. And yet it's clearly building upon chapter 6 and its consideration of God's relation to Adam as his reasonable creature. The righteous law, back in chapter 6, that God gave to Adam, which had been unto life had he kept it, back in 6:1, is now described as obedience which will attain the reward of life by way of covenant. And paragraph 2, then, of our confession goes back to Adam again and to his previously stated failure to obey and the resultant curse. Moreover, man, having brought himself under the curse of the law by his fall. That's the covenant curse. Again, it's clear that the confession here is referring back to Adam's fall in the context of paragraph 1 as a failure to attain the reward of life by covenant, but instead bringing himself under the curse. All the elements of the covenant of works are certainly here just without the exact words. And then finally, and even if possible, even more clearly, is the other place in which our Baptist forefathers decided to omit the explicit language of covenant of works in 19:1. And while this is another place in our confession that deletes the specific reference to the covenant of works in both the Westminster and the Savoy, both the Westminster and the Savoy have it, it's hard to imagine any 17th century Puritan reading this paragraph and thinking anything other than this is a clear confession of the substance of that covenant. It's so clear. God gave to Adam a law of universal obedience written in his heart, and a particular precept of not eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, by which he bound him and all his posterity to personal, entire, exact, and perpetual obedience, promising life upon the fulfilling, and threatening death upon the breach of it, and endued him with power and ability to keep it. Again, moral law, positive prohibition, representative headship, promised reward, threatened punishment, all the elements are there, just not the term. And to paraphrase Cox and his statement earlier about the substance of something being there, even where the explicit terminology is not, if it looks like the covenant of works, if it walks like the covenant of works, if it quacks like the covenant of works, it is the covenant of works. And especially as you compare this with the extant writings of the signatories and others in that day, they're explicitly here, well, not explicitly, but virtually, other than using the exact word, confessing the covenant of works. That's where we can see the elements of the traditional doctrine of in the confession. But as I said, there's even some places where the confession has retained the explicit terminology of the covenant of works as well. In fact, even though the term is omitted here from chapter 19, paragraph 1, it is retained later in this very same chapter in paragraph 6, and not just once, but twice. We read in paragraph 6, although true believers be not under the law as a covenant of works to be thereby condemned or justified. And then later, the promise of it likewise, the promises of the law, likewise show them, believers, God's approbation of obedience, and what blessings they may expect upon the performance thereof, though not as due to them by the law as a covenant of works. So here are two references to a covenant of works. And some have pointed out this isn't an explicit reference to the covenant of works, but to sort of the general concept of a covenant of works. But in the context of this chapter, which is about the law, particularly the moral law of God, what paragraph 6 is really dealing with is the relation that believers now have to that law. It's asserting, in other words, the third use of the law. That the moral law continues to be binding upon believers as a rule of life, telling us how we ought to live, pleasing to God in grateful obedience, but not as a covenant of works, no longer, that is, as condemning us for our disobedience, nor meritoriously justifying or rewarding us for our obedience. But important to realize here, this paragraph is making a contrast. It's contrasting the function of the law for believers with the functioning of that law for Adam and for unbelievers. And the assumption would be that for Adam and for unbelievers, this law did and does function as a covenant of works. And so it's a contrast. It's the whole point of chapter 19 is to talk about the moral law and distinguish it in different forms from other types of law and how they function for different people. And if the covenant of works no longer, or the law no longer functions as a covenant of works for believers, the implication is it did function that way for Adam, and it still does function in that way for unbelievers. So, maybe obliquely, but certainly the idea, there was a covenant of works with Adam, and the law served as the heart of that. But chapter 20, paragraph 1, really has to be considered the proverbial nail in the coffin of this argument that the confession itself doesn't have any idea or is redefining the covenant of works. Even Dr. Nichols has to admit that this is an unmistakable confession of a pre-fall covenant of works. Let's read this. Paragraph 1, the covenant of works being broken by sin and made unprofitable unto life, God was pleased to give forth the promise of Christ, the seed of the woman. And so what this means is that prior to the giving of the proto-evangelium, prior to the promise of the seed of the woman, the covenant of works had been broken by sin. There's no way to read that except as a reference to Adam and Eve's sin and its breaking of the covenant of works in the garden. And the gospel is the solution, then, to the consequences of that broken covenant of works. This is this chapter that was added by the Savoy and by the Baptists of the gospel. You just had a chapter on the law. How can you have a chapter on the law and not have a chapter on the gospel? And so the law, which functioned as a covenant of works, they immediately move into that covenant of works was broken. And so then, the gospel. Dr. Nichols can only suggest that the retention of this explicit reference to the covenant of works here is an inconsistency. That's quoting him, an inconsistency or even, quote, an oversight. An oversight. Yeah, they missed it. He goes on to say, one of you may someday obtain a PhD for discovering why they left it in chapter 20 and deleted it from chapter 7 and 19. I can't explain that. It appears mysterious and somewhat inconsistent to me. Perhaps it was an oversight. If there is a theological rationale for it, I don't perceive it. And I think therein lies the rub. Was there a theological rationale for omitting the term covenant of works in these earlier places in the confession? As we have seen from the confession itself, from the writings of the signatories of the confession, there was demonstrably not a theological rationale for omitting the term covenant of works, at least not the theological rationale of communicating some deviation from the Westminster and the Savoy doctrine of the covenant of works. But might there be some other rationale for why this language was omitted? And presumably, yes, if we're to take the signatories of our confession at their word. And I think that legitimate rationales might be suggested, among other things, by considering finally the structure and style of the confession. Now here, sadly but providentially, we have no positive explanation of the rationales behind the changes that our confession made to the Westminster and the Savoy. Had God allowed Nehemiah Cox to live longer, perhaps we would have had those answers. And because of this, so to a certain extent, we can only offer suggestions. But we can now, I think thanks to the work of the aforementioned brothers, offer historically informed suggestions. By the time that our confession was published in 1677, our particular Baptist forefathers, as Jim mentioned yesterday, did have the privilege, and it was a privilege, of over 3 decades of reflection on the Westminster Confession, and almost 2 decades of reflection on the Savoy Declaration. It's entirely conceivable, then, that they dedicated a lot of time and thought and effort into studying those documents and considering the tremendous strength of those documents, but also to think about where those documents could be tweaked, could be refined in ways, particularly in respect to structure and style. As we've already seen, they were following the Savoy, but they thought, okay, we're looking at the structure of the Westminster, and this is fantastic, but they've got a chapter on the law. We got to have a chapter on the gospel next to this. So we're so thankful. We greatly respect and appreciate this document, but maybe here's one way in which it could be slightly refined. They certainly made clear their overwhelming appreciation and respect for those confessions, acknowledged openly their dependence upon them, but they also felt free to adjust and I'm sure they hoped improve upon them in some ways. Now, there seems to me at least two categories of reasons as to why the framers of our confession may have consciously decided to omit the explicit terminology of the covenant of works in these various places. Some relate to the structure of our confession. Some relate to, if I might use the word, the style of our confession. Now, there very well may have been historical reasons beyond my level of knowledge to perceive in omitting that language. I'll leave that to the doctors Renahan. But I just want to point out the possible positive reasons that may have existed other than rejection or redefinition or an attempt to refute that doctrine in some way. So first, as to the structure of the confession, as Dr. Renahan argued yesterday, covenant is a major structural category for our confession. And all of chapters 7 through 20, so chapter 7 makes that transition. It introduces the category of covenant for the first time in our confession. And then really the main body of the rest of our confession through chapter 20, so 13 chapters, is dedicated to the fleshing out of what that covenant is. Talking about the definition of the covenant, talking about the covenant mediator, talking about the covenant blessings, talking about the covenant graces. And that's not an artificial structure that Jim has imposed upon the text. This is how our particular Baptist forefathers talked about these things. Justification, sanctification, adoption, those are covenant blessings. They're blessings of the covenant. Faith and perseverance and repentance, those are graces of the covenant. That's the explicit language that they use. And it's a significant structural category for our confession itself. And chapter 7 that marks the transition from the first principles to that main body on the covenant, even the title of chapter 7, our confession makes a subtle change from the Westminster and the Savoy. In the Westminster and the Savoy, chapter 7 is entitled, Of God's Covenant with Man. Of God's Covenant with Man. If you're talking about a covenant with man in general, I think most naturally our minds might gravitate toward what we call the covenant of works. It's with man, with Adam as that man. But our confession shortens that and just says, of God's covenant. And again, notice it's God's covenant singular. I think this is an indication in general that our confession reserves the term covenant without further description to describe the covenant of grace, and then to highlight the fundamental unity of the history of redemption from the fall, from the institution of the covenant of grace. This is common, again, with Puritans and particular Baptists of the time, to refer to the covenant of grace, not as we always do as the covenant of grace, but simply as the covenant, or God's covenant. That was the covenant par excellence. That was the covenant, the essential covenant for our salvation. And this is perhaps one of the primary reasons why our confession and the authors of our confession decided against using the term covenant of works in 6:1 and in 7:1. Again, in chapter 6, they had not yet defined what a covenant is. They gave all the elements of it, the express elements of it, but they hadn't even defined it. I mean, again, 7:1 is the place where covenant is defined. And even then, it's defined in a somewhat general sense because it's coming at the beginning of the chapter on God's covenant, singular. And it's introducing that concept of covenant particularly so that we might come to understand the nature of the covenant of grace, God's covenant with his people in Christ. And then chapter 7 is looking forward. It's looking ahead to that development of various elements of the covenant of grace in the next 13 chapters. And so covenant there is reserved in general to describe the covenant of grace. I need to move on. So perhaps just even structural, especially the omissions in chapter 6 and chapter 7, can be explained in those terms. We're sort of reserving that and looking forward to the development of the covenant of grace in the very structure of the confession itself. We don't want to confuse the idea of covenant before we get to that, the covenant, God's covenant. The second possible positive reason why in some places this term covenant of works has been omitted is just in general what I have termed the style of the confession. Our confession and the authors of our confession, again, at times made some changes to the Westminster and the Savoy, I think purely for stylistic reasons. and it might possibly, again, explain some of these. It does it quite frequently. They're trying to smooth things out, or they're trying in places to be more precise or more concise. I think perhaps that's why Westminster, they omitted Westminster and Savoy 7, paragraph 2, right? Because in chapter 7, paragraph 2, in both the Westminster and the Savoy, it comes back and just really fully defines the covenant of works, labels it and then gives a description for that. And I think our authors of our confession by that point realized it's kind of redundant to do that, right? In 6:1, they've already laid out the covenant of works. They laid out all of those elements. And now, again, you're in this chapter of God's covenant that is primarily about the covenant of grace. Why step back and sort of pull back to the covenant of works? Because, again, they imported a lot of that information and those elements into chapter 6, which really was probably a more natural place for that to occur, because it's about the fall, and it's about the sin of man and the consequences of it. And so perhaps just to avoid a redundancy and not to break up the flow of thought in chapter 7, maybe just purely for that sort of stylistic concern. Also, I think perhaps in chapter 19, paragraph 1, the other place, again, what our confession does is it follows the Savoy in expanding this section from the Westminster with the elements of the covenant of works. And then, though, they decided that the phrase, as a covenant of works, was therefore unnecessary. They'd already described it, and perhaps it was just, again, redundant. Just in one place to show you how sometimes they do this, in the very next paragraph of chapter 19, there are two words that our confession omits, and clearly just purely for the sake of style, just purely to avoid kind of redundancy, to be more concise. It's the same law, paragraph 2, that was first written in the heart of man, continued to be a perfect rule of righteousness after the fall, and was delivered by God upon Mount Sinai in 10 commandments, and written in 2 tables, the first 4 containing our duty towards God, and the other 6 our duty to man. In both the Westminster and the Savoy, the ending of that paragraph reads, in 10 commandments and written in 2 tables, the 4 first commandments containing our duty toward God, and the other 6 commandments our duty to man. Now, are they making some sort of fundamental, distinction there? Are they trying to emphasize? No, they're just, for the reasons of style and for conciseness, they just omitted that word. It was unnecessary there. And there are multiple times where that happens, but it's funny, just in the very next paragraph, in Dr. Renehan's laying out in True Confessions, you see that very clearly. The phrase in paragraph 1, as a covenant of works, is missing, where it's there in the Westminster and Savoy, and then in the very next paragraph, the word commandments is missing in both the Savoy and the Westminster. And again, too, just perhaps even for a further reason, the focus of chapter 19 is on the law of God, in particular, the moral law of God. And they've already made the distinction that they need to make between the moral and the positive law of God in that original arrangement with Adam in paragraph 1. So why did our confession omit several explicit references to the covenant of works? Well, we can definitely say from the evidence of the signatories, from the statements of the confession itself, that reason was not in any way an attempt to reject or redefine that doctrine as confessed in the Westminster and Savoy. Whereas matters of structure and style simply may suggest very simple positive reasons for why that language was omitted. But all this to say is that, yes, our confession contains a full-fledged understanding of the covenant of works. And as we conclude, maybe just a word of reminding us why this is important. Why spend all this time, sort of reminding ourselves and convincing ourselves again that the covenant of works is confessed in our confession? Well, Nehemiah Cox wrote in the introduction to his chapter on the covenant of works, he wrote, "The right understanding of these things is not only necessary, but lies at the very foundation of all useful knowledge of ourselves and of the mind of God in all these revelations of his will and counsel to the children of men, which he has made in following ages, either before or in the law of Moses or by the word of the gospel. If a man misses the right account of this, the covenant of works, he is certainly bewildered in all further searching for that truth which most concerns him to know." And this just takes us back to some of the things that Dr. Van Drunen was instructing us in last night in Romans 5. Our understanding of Adam as our covenant head has significant implications for how we understand the representative covenant headship of Christ and the imputation of his righteousness to us. One of my professors in seminary, Dr. Estelle, used to use a phrase, and particularly when he was talking about the covenant of works. And he was saying that the covenant of works, and a proper understanding of that, it's not essential for salvation. He says, but it gives us a thicker as opposed to a thinner understanding of the gospel. I always like that. It's a fuller understanding of the gospel. And of course, the fuller our understanding of the gospel is, the more we understand the person and the office and the work of Christ as our perfect covenant representative. And then the more we understand and appreciate that, the greater will be our gratitude, the deeper will be our love, the more faithful and joyous will be our obedience, and the more profound will be our praise, and the more glory he will receive. Thank you.